Hello everyone, I'm Zach Weiss, co-founder of Worn & Wound, and today I'll be taking a look at the Minase Divido Urushi. Before we get into it, if this review is helpful to you, you find it informative or entertaining, please like and subscribe below. Some watches are quite easy to understand at a glance. They have a formal language that we're used to. Perhaps they're based on trends of the day. These days, anything kind of mid-century styled, vintage, military style seems to be fairly common, but occasionally a watch comes along or a brand comes along that does their own thing and really kind of has an aesthetic that stands apart from everything else. Minase is one of these brands. They seem to have sort of been created in a silo, and that is part of both the challenge of the brand, but also what makes them so exciting. This isn't a watch or a brand that you can sort of take in at a glance. Their watches take some time to sort of wrap your head around, and in my experience of wearing it, as I'll go through, even take some time on the wrist to really kind of get used to. It's something that needs to seep in. It's a brand with entirely their own aesthetic. They march to the beat of their own drum, and I'm pretty excited to tell you about it today. So Minase is a Japanese brand. They're part of a larger company called Kyowa Company Limited, which was founded in 1963 and is a manufacturer of cutting tools such as drill bits. This is actually shown in the Minase logo, sort of a stepped V shape, which is actually the kind of the outline or silhouette of a drill bit tip. Over many years, they created tons of expertise in that industry and eventually got into the world of watches and watch case manufacturing. There, they gained more expertise and eventually moved into manufacturing their own brand in 2005, which is Minase. One of the expertises that they achieved in that time is something that you're probably familiar with, which is called Salatz polishing, or more commonly referred to as Zaratsu polishing. So that is the kind of black mirror polishing technique that uses the flat side of a certain machine called the Salatz machine. And that is something that I think has become sort of synonymous with high-end Japanese manufacturing, watch manufacturing at this point. So Minase then sort of uses this expertise, and I'd say in terms of the aesthetic, pulls from something entirely different. So there's a mix of some traditional Japanese concepts in there. They refer to Yosegi Zaikao, and I apologize if I pronounced that incorrectly, which is a form of traditional Japanese marquetry, as well as inspiration from Japanese puzzle boxes. And as I go through the watch and how it kind of functions or how it comes together, that'll make a little bit more sense. So the Minase Divido, and once again, I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing that correctly, but that is a Esperanto word that means division. I don't speak Esperanto. It's probably the brand's easiest watch to digest because it has a circular case. So that's at least one thing that we're familiar with. Many of their other watches are rectangular or other kind of stranger shapes. It measures 40.5 millimeters in diameter, 48.6 millimeters lug to lug, and 12.27 millimeters in height. So it's a fairly, normal size watch. It's a slightly medium watch, but it's a very modern watch. So it is sort of in that sort of like a normal size for a very contemporary styled watch. Obviously, looking at the case a little bit, you'll see that there's a lot of facets and angles. So this is really where things get interesting. To think of this as a case, the way you might think of other brands' cases, is sort of not the right way to go about it. A lot of brands will have a three-part case, let's say, like a crystal bezel, then a mid case and a case back. So it's actually 4 parts. In the case of the Minase, it's really a system of pieces, and that is based on a whole concept they have called MORE, Minase Original Rebuilding Equation, which apparently is patented, and I don't know exactly how, but that is based on how those Japanese puzzles and how that wood marquetry would come together. So these components, such as these lugs and the mid case here, are created from several pieces each, and then all kind of attached through the case back where there's just 4 screws. So there's many components here. It's actually hard to sort of discern which is a piece, an individual piece, and which is like several pieces put together. But as you look at it, especially from the case side, you can see like the lug here is this form that kind of fits into this mid case. There's a bevel on it. There's a sort of a point where it cuts in. There's a lot of acute angles, things that couldn't be made from traditional machining. So these are pieces that come together to create this. Now the concept here, like on top of creating something that's a bit more complex and requiring a lot of exceptional finishing, is that everything can come apart. So let's say you severely damage a lug. In theory, you can send this back to Japan. they will take that lug off and they can replace the full lug. Therefore, the watch as a whole will kind of come together and can last longer. The way these pieces all come together is quite brilliant. There's a lot of interesting nooks and crannies carved into all of them, which you can see in an exploded diagram that the brand provides, which really kind of shows the level of complexity that's going into this. And of course, then, as I said, with each of these components, you then have all the finishing. So there's brushing on them, there's polished bevels, which are likely done on a slots machine. So you have that level of real fit and finish. And this is, of course, has to be executed by hand. So there's, really a remarkable amount of labor that goes into these watches. The actual look of it, I mean, it's really intense. It's sort of brutalist. It's very futuristic. It's unlike other watches I've seen, as I've said before. And because of that, it takes, like I said, some time to sort of get used to. This isn't something that I really have like a reference point for. There's a almost appealing sci-fi-ness to it, something a little futuristic, but also something kind of brutalist and architectural in a very literal way. That's a term that's overused often, but this watch looks like some sort of brutalist coliseum from the side in particular, and you can see these maws of a lug kind of coming out to you like a gateway. It's very dramatic, it's very intense, and it's very sculptural. Every angle on this watch has something going on, some level of finishing, some angle. There's never a dull moment. The dial then actually gets the same treatment as the case. Nothing here is as it seems and constructed in the way that a typical watch is. So when you're looking at the dial, you're actually not just looking at the dial. You're looking at the interior sort of system that holds the movement and other components of the watch together. So there's a capsule that is holding the movement that the dial then comes down on and has several pieces and is then attached at the corners via the middle of the case, all internal, so it's sort of floating within the watch. Creates more of a sort of a dynamic feel to it, and is definitely very different than the way most watches come together. This is certainly Minase's own sort of concept on how that works. And as such, there's a really appealing three-dimensionality to the dial that matches everything around it, matches the case. If you saw this with a completely flat dial, I think it would lose some of its interest. It would be a clash of sort of styles. And so Minase really thoroughly designed this dial to be kind of wild. So the way I wrap my mind around this is to think of it as three sections. There's this outer section of sort of pincer-like markers that look like applied markers, but these are actually coming up and around the side of that capsule and then coming over on top of it. When you look at the dial, you can see there's actually spaces between the side of the interior case and the edge of the dial at certain points. So the watch actually has like this floating look and like light passes through it. But if you're looking at that angle from like a low side perspective, you can see how those markers run all the way down. So they give the illusion of actually being like the suspension points that this dial is floating within. It's pretty intense. Then each of those markers is very well finished. It's faceted. Each one has its own design. There's a little line of white paint going down them. They're, just as like overly machined and designed as everything around it. You then have a black ring that functions as sort of a standard chapter ring for minutes and seconds. This is actually the most normal thing on the entire watch. It almost feels under-designed in comparison, but it does add some needed legibility, and I don't think, in the practice of wearing it, that wasn't a problem, having that added bit of just basic legibility there. And then you get to this central dial. And this is a very special moment on the watch. This is the Urushi lacquer center. This is a copper plate that has been painted by an artisan with red Urushi lacquer. Urushi lacquer is derived from sap from the Urushi tree. It's a traditional Japanese method. It creates this kind of plastic-like finish. I mean, it looks like something that's synthetic, but it's not actually. And then in addition, it has a Maki-e finish as well, which in this case is a sprinkling of silver flakes that are applied to the drying Urushi lacquer, and then that whole thing is polished to bring up a sort of sparkle effect. So these have to be handmade, this little part here, and hand finished, so it adds this kind of traditional technique back into this watch that is hyper modern. Something that I really like about this is that although it adds this kind of older technique to it, rather than the watch meeting it in a traditional way, the watch didn't become more, kind of classic looking or traditional. They use it in this really modern context. Probably the most controversial design element on the dial is the date window. As you can see here on the right side at 3, it is much more than your average date window. There's a cutout in that red Urushi lacquer plate, giving it an almost like Pac-Man-like silhouette. And then through there, you have an opening to the date window or to the date disc, which shows 3 date spots. There's a little arrow there, then pointing pointing to the central date, which, would indicate where you would set the day that's current. Typically on watches, I don't like this kind of date window. I don't need to know the day before, the day after the current date. I'm capable of figuring that out myself. But on this watch, I think they had a real challenge trying to include the date, because a typical window, just like a square punched through window, something like that, just wouldn't have suited the feel of this watch. So they had to go for something a little bit more angular, a little bit more contemporary, and I think visually speaking, at the very least, it does suit the watch. Conceptually, I might not love that, I just don't need it, but it doesn't feel out of place here. So that's a challenging thing, and I honestly would love to see a non-date version of this watch as well. But as far as the date execution goes, I think their options were limited, and this is an option that worked well. Looking at the hands now, you have these beautifully finished handset. It's sort of a Dauphine style, but modernized. You have truncated tips. You have brushing down the center of the hour and the minute hand, polished edges. They hold up under a loop as well. You can get really close in this. They're beautifully crafted. There's loom strips on the hour and minute hand. One thing I will say is that this watch is lacking in loom, generally speaking. That is the only loom that's there. With that white line that's on those applied markers, I feel like there was an opportunity for more loom, and I kind of wish they had used it, but as is, all that's there is the hour and minute hand, and it's not exceptional loom either, it's just average. The minute hand has this really beautiful detail where it curves to match the dimensionality of the dial. And they really curved the hell out of it, because that dial really drops down. So there's a really nice just three-dimensionality to it that is just very appealing and very attractive. There's a red tip to the second hand. Doesn't really feel necessary, but I don't mind it either. And there's a little cap over the central pinion, which is something I always really like to see. I feel like that's a little point of finishing on dials that a lot of brands forget about. And just not seeing that little hole that's going down is I don't know, there's something just appealing about that. It feels like that little extra bit of detailing that makes this a higher end watch. The bracelet of the Divido might at a glance seem like the most classic kind of element of the entire watch, but in reality it's been designed from the ground up and is very much designed with the same ethos as the rest of the case and the dial. So what seems simple is actually quite complex. In the most basic terms, it has a 20 millimeter end link here, but they do a really cool little trick here where the end link actually appears to flare out. And that's to match the kind of strange interior angles of these lugs, which, because they're machined individually, can have sort of impossible angles in them that you wouldn't be able to get from milling it all at once. So it looks like it gets wider. It actually does get wider, but only for like the top portion of the end link. There is still a 20 millimeter channel in there. So when you take this out, you can still fit in a normal 20 millimeter strap. From there, you have a 5-piece design that features brushed and polished top surfaces. Each of these has been finished individually, so you actually have polished bevels along the edge. This polished band that runs down both sides is then, probably Salat's polished. The other feature of this that is kind of quite unique is that from the side, you'll notice that there are no attachment points for this bracelet. There's no holes where a pin might go through. There's no screw head on the outer side of it where you might remove a link. Of course, it is a sizable bracelet. So the way they did that was put the screws on the inside of the link and then make what is one of the most complicated links I've ever seen in my life. You get to experience the sort of jigsaw puzzle-esque nature of their design strategy firsthand, because it's a bit of a puzzle to get them back together. It takes a little while, it takes a little bit of patience, but once you do it, it's done, of course. My biggest concern would be that if you brought this to a jeweler, they would just have no idea what to do with it, because it is not, a common type of bracelet. So should you be looking to purchase this, you might want to send Minase your wrist size details so they'll size it for you in Japan. But that aside, it is quite an elegant solution, quite a nicely finished bracelet as well. The clasp here is a very simple clasp, very small, 2 buttons on either side. One thing I did find that was a little strange, and this could be because of the shape of my wrist, was that there's a bit of a kink where the bracelet met the clasp, and that's just a little bit inelegant, and I kind of wish that hadn't just been the case there. Lastly, one slightly funny thing about this bracelet is that I did find it squeaked a little bit while I was wearing it, and that is, from metal rubbing against metal. So every now and then, as I'd be walking around, I'd hear a little like sound, and kind of strange, not necessarily the most aesthetically pleasing thing to have. So I'm not sure if that's something they could work out, or if that is, once again, just from the specifics of how it fit my wrist. On the wrist, the Divido is, like I said, hard to compare to anything else. I don't have a frame of reference for a watch that looks like this. I sort of have to take it in all on its own and process it anew, which is a new circuit. It's something I haven't had to do in a really long time. It took some time to settle in, but it is a watch that grew on me. There's a certain industrial, luxurious, harsh, ostentatious, sort of strange sci-fi vibe to this, if that makes any sense to you. It is both decorative and industrial in a way that is just quite unique, but the harshness of the design doesn't translate to the ergonomics. It is still actually a watch that's been very well considered as to how it wears. The lugs do curve down fairly generously, so it hugs your wrist, and it's 12.7 millimeters tall, which, isn't really that tall for a watch that's 40.5 millimeters wide and fairly rugged in its general build, but a decent amount of that height is also coming from a domed sapphire crystal here, a box sapphire crystal, really. So it actually feels quite a bit thinner, and it rides low. I felt like it, stayed kind of close to my wrist. And then, as you're wearing it, you can see the way the light hits this thing. I mean, it is a very dynamic watch. It is very attractive. And this mix of traditional elements and hyper modern elements, it just has a style all into itself. And it didn't feel formal, it didn't feel too sporty, it didn't feel too strange. It was actually quite wearable, if it did take a little time to get used to. Powering the Minase Divido is the KT7001-1, which is a rebadged Sellita SW200. It has been decorated, I believe, in-house using, perlage technique, as well as it has a customized rotor. SW200 is an ETA 2824 clone. It's a good Swiss-made movement, but it is not exactly an exotic movement. And I think there's a bit of a trade-off going on here. So the complexity that you have in the rest of the watch, the sheer amount of labor that goes into the machining and finishing of a case that's quite so complex, of a bracelet that's quite so complex, adds up. So the price of this watch, which I know I haven't gotten to yet, I think is really from there. And in order to keep the price relatively low, they had to go with a more common movement. So just to get to it, I mean, the price of this watch is 6,600 Swiss francs, or around $7,200 USD at the time of recording. That is, by no means inexpensive, and it certainly puts the watch thoroughly in luxury territory. And at that price point, a Sellita SW200 is not the most exciting movement. That is a movement that you will regularly find in watches, hovering around the $1,000 price point, sometimes lower, obviously sometimes more as well. Obviously they did decorate it. It looks very nice, and it is a reliable movement. But, the real cost for this watch is coming from everything around it. This is one of the most complicated watches I've ever seen. I think they have a bit of a choice to be made. Sure, there's probably higher-end Swiss e-Bausches out there. You have brands like Vaucher making, micro rotor movements. But I think that would up the price of this, and I'm just guesstimating here, but well into the low five figures at that point. And it's a different customer, it's a different value concept. And I think for what you're getting here, there actually really is quite a decent value, and you're getting it from a brand that has a fairly small output. So according to Minase's own literature, they produce under 500 watches a year. So that is really, on the smaller side. Let's say you love this watch and you don't really want to pay $7,200. There actually are less expensive options. This is the most expensive version of the Divido that currently exists. So you could get the same watch on a rubber strap, and that'll save you 1,100 Swiss francs, which is a significant amount of money right there. There are other versions of the Divido that don't have the Urushi lacquer center. The Divido 2.0, as it's called, still has an incredibly beautiful dial to it. It features almost a hammered texture with a dégradé sort of coloration in various different colors. And that on rubber starts at 4,300 Swiss francs. So significantly less, not, once again, inexpensive, but the value is even more clear there. To kind of wrap up my thoughts on the Minase, I think this is a watch that is going to find its own audience. It's not for everyone. It's a bit strange. It's a bit bizarre. But I think in the context of a market where watches are getting harder and harder to find, the hype machine is making certain brands blow up. Brands that used to be just for enthusiasts are now, getting more mainstream, and you can't get them, or you have to get them in crazy little windows of time. And then brands that used to be household names, you can't go to the store and buy anymore. So it's a bit of a strange time, and finding a brand that offers something, I think, quite as unique and quite as exotic as Minase is fairly rare. So now is a good opportunity to pick up a brand like Minase, of which there are, few and far between before the, eye of the zeitgeist reaches them. For the full review on the Minase Divido, please head to wornandwound.com. Thank you, and see you again.